Today I'm joined by Dr. Brian John and his book, The Stonehenge Bluestones. Good afternoon, Brian. Thanks for joining us.
Hello, how are you?
I'm fine. Are you okay?
Yeah, very good.
So what's the background behind the book, Brian, would you say?
Well, it's an interest I've had for many years. I've been writing a lot of books on all sorts of different things, mostly relating to West Wales. But I've always had this interest in Stonehenge and the connection with the Bluestones, because it's been known for about a century now that the Bluestones, which are quite variable actually, but they seem to mostly come from the Preseli area in Pembrokeshire. So I've had this very strong interest in the stones themselves and in how they might have travelled from Pembrokeshire to Stonehenge. As you probably know, there's a major dispute going on between the archaeologists and the earth scientists on this matter of how the stones were actually moved.
So am I right in saying that you believe not by Neolithic man transported them, but by a glacier? Is that correct?
Yes, I mean, the human transport idea is very popular and rather wacky, and people like wacky ideas. But when you actually look into it in detail, there is no evidence to support the human transport idea at all. Nobody's ever found a sledge or a raft or a piece of rope or an abandoned stone or any trackways or anything like that. There's a complete absence of evidence. And on the other hand, when you look at the alternative theory, which is the theory of glacial transport, there's a great deal of evidence in support of that, because we know that on at least two occasions, the Irish Sea Glacier, which was the biggest glacier in the British Isles during the Ice Age, actually passed across Pembrokeshire, passed over Preseli. The whole of Pembrokeshire and West Wales was deeply covered in ice, and it flowed across Carmarthen Bay, up the Bristol Channel and into Somerset. So we don't know how far it travelled, whether it actually reached Stonehenge itself, but that's a possibility. And there's a lot of evidence that this very big glacier did move a great deal of erratic material, stones and boulders and gravel, over a very large distance from West Wales all the way to Somerset, at least to the area of the Somerset levels.
So I'm thinking of a glacier as obviously floating in the sea.
The sea wasn't there at the time. We've got to remember that...
we were joined to France, were we?
During the big glacial episodes, there's so much moisture is locked up in the ice sheets that sea level drops. And during the glaciation that we're talking about here, which is about 500,000 years ago, sea level was about 120 metres lower than it is now.
Right.
So this wouldn't have been a floating glacier. This would have been perfectly standard, large glacier flowing across land, of course across the Bristol Channel, Carmarthen Bay area, which was all dry land at the time. So there wouldn't have been any particular obstacle in the way of seawater, because the sea simply wasn't there. So
there's no evidence of quarrying at Preseli, is there? Because, for instance, these rocks, were they about 2 to 4 tons each, do they?
They're quite large, but they're very variable. Some of them are to about 4 tons. Some of them seem to be less than a ton. But the interesting thing about them is that they're not all pillars. If you listen to the archaeologists, they will probably tell you that the Stonehenge Bluestones are all pillars. Actually, only about half a dozen of them are pillars. The others are just boulders of all shapes and sizes. Some of them like slabs, and some of them are, just big rounded boulders lying around all over the place at Stonehenge. 43 of them altogether. They just don't look like quarried stones. They're very weathered and very rounded, most of them. They just look like a collection of glacial erratics. And if you look at the so-called evidence of quarrying in Pembrokeshire, you find that actually, again, there is no evidence. The archaeologists claim that they have found 2 quarries in recent years. But what I do in the book is I look in detail at the evidence that they've given in support of this quarrying idea. I've looked at with 2 colleagues, David Ellis-Gruffydd and John Downes, and the 3 of us have written 2 papers on this in scientific journals. And we say that when we look at the evidence, all of the so-called quarrying evidence is simply natural features. All of these features are perfectly easily explained by natural processes. So there's a major difference of opinion between the archaeologists and the earth scientists as to what is visible in these so-called quarries and what the evidence actually means.
Everybody will say to you that all the way from Salisbury to Pembroke, or from Pembroke to Salisbury, is an awful long way for anything to travel, isn't it?
It's no problem for a glacier.
Oh, right, okay.
The glaciers during the Ice Age were enormous. They travelled thousands of kilometres. And we know, for example, that the ice that affected South Wales, the ice that affected Pembrokeshire, come all the way from Scotland. There are erratics from Scotland and from Northern Ireland and the Irish Sea, all the way down across Pembrokeshire and into Carmarthen Bay. And some of these very, very far-travelled erratics are actually found on the coasts of Devon and Cornwall as well. So distance is no obstacle as far as glaciers are concerned, but of course distance is a huge obstacle as far as Neolithic tribesmen are concerned. I certainly think that there is no evidence from anywhere in our prehistory of tribesmen carrying stones over these great distances, because if you look at the cromlechs that we have in Wales and all the various standing stones, they're all built of stones that were simply picked up in the vicinity. None of them are built of stones that have been carried a long way. That's another reason why I think the human transport hypothesis is really rather a crazy one, simply because there's no evidence in support of it, really.
So we're talking about time then, aren't we, when France and the UK were joined together, where there was no kind of English Channel there. That's what we're talking about, that sort of time, are we?
Yes, I mean, what happens during the Ice Age is that every time there's a glacial episode, water gets locked up into the ice sheets and sea level drops, usually down to about 100 metres or 120 metres below its present level. And then in the interglacial periods, as they're called, the warmer periods, the ice melts and the water returns to the oceans again, and sea level just pops back up again to something like its present level. And it's done this over and over again during the Ice Age, so we can actually trace from certain parts of the Earth all these ups and downs of sea level that have gone on since the beginning of the Ice Age.
And these stones came from 30 different locations. Do you believe that?
Yes, I do. I think the archaeologists would have us believe that they come from just 2 or 3 locations. That isn't supported by the geological evidence. The geologists have identified about half a dozen different rock types, but even within those particular groups of rocks, there's a lot of variation. They certainly haven't all come from the same places. And if you actually tot up the number of different rock types in terms of their sort of detailed characteristics, if you tot that up, looking at about 30 different locations from which these stones have come.
And they're all blue stones.
I think it would be crazy to assume that there are 30 different quarries. and so what, I mean, they just look like an assortment of glacial erratics that have been picked up and transported by ice over a very long distance.
And they're all blue stones, are they?
The word bluestones is a bit crazy, really. It doesn't mean anything. It's not a geological term.
Right.
The word bluestone simply means any stone at Stonehenge which doesn't happen to be sarsen stone. The local stones there are sarsen stones, which is a sort of sandstone that's found scattered about on Salisbury Plain on the chalk. The big standing stones, the big monoliths and the trilithons and so on at Stonehenge are actually made of sarsen stone. But the bluestones are much smaller. They're the little stones. And they were called bluestones originally because they had a slightly bluish colour to them.
Yeah.
When they're wet, you can see a slightly bluish tinge. It's a meaningless term, really, and it doesn't mean anything in geological terms.
I read somewhere that somebody reckoned they were dug up 500 years before being erected. Is that something you've come across?
Oh, yeah, I've come across that. I mean, again, I've looked very, very carefully at the radiocarbon dating evidence. They found a lot of radiocarbon evidence in these places that they've been investigating, and the radiocarbon evidence just doesn't support that. What the radiocarbon dates have come from a huge scatter of different episodes during the prehistoric period, dating through from about 9,000-10,000 years ago right up to the Roman period and even up to the Middle Ages. So there's lots of different materials in these sites that have accumulated over a very long period of time. But if you ask this question, is there any radiocarbon evidence that shows when these quarries, so-called, were actually operating? There isn't. I think the radiocarbon evidence actually shows that the quarrying idea is nonsensical because it just doesn't stack up.
It seems then archaeologists are making the facts up as they go along. So Stone Age, is not finished. So what is it?
Sorry, what is the...
I'm saying that Stonehenge, they're saying that Stonehenge is not finished, so what is it? Yeah.
Archaeologists actually seem to be moving quite strongly in this direction at the moment. The reason being that Stonehenge, as we know, is a shambolic old ruin, really. There are supposed to be 80 or so sarsen stones, but there are only about 50. There are 30 so-called stones that have gone missing completely, or else they weren't there to start with. And there are supposed to be about 80 or 82 bluestones, according to the archaeologists, but there are actually only 43. So about half of the bluestones that are assumed to have been there are not there at all. And then when we look in detail how the different stone settings have been developed at Stonehenge, we find that the stones have been moved about all over the place. There have been many different stone settings, and the stone settings that we can see at the moment are just the latest in a sequence of attempts by the builders of Stonehenge to move things around, and they seem to have changed their minds over and over again, which suggests to me, and I think it's also suggesting to other people as well, that Stonehenge was just never finished, that they didn't have enough stones. So I think it's perfectly reasonable to suggest that the builders of Stonehenge had very big ambitions, and they had a rather grand plan, but they never had enough stones to finish the job. So they used whatever stones they had and moved them about into one setting after another. And I think in the end, they probably discovered that they were having to go so far afield to gather up the stones that they needed that they simply did a sort of cost-benefit analysis in the end, and decided the effort involved in going further and further away from Salisbury Plain in order to find their stones just wasn't worth the effort. So they just shrugged their shoulders and gave up on it. I think there's a very strong argument that Stonehenge was never actually finished.
But, just finally, I mean, whatever you believe, these stones weigh in between 2 and 4 tons. It took a lot to actually lift them on top of each other, didn't it, to sort of give you that sort of what image you've got now?
Oh yeah, I mean, we have to be very impressed by the fact that the big stones, I mean, some of them are 18, 20 tons almost.
Oh, right, more than that, okay,
really
yeah.
Big, the sarsen stones. So there's certainly a very major and a very impressive feat of engineering to have built Stonehenge, or even to have embarked on this project. You have to feel impressed by the effort and the imagination and the technical ability of the people who built Stonehenge. But certainly, I think there's very strong evidence that nowhere else in British prehistory do we have big stones being carried over long distances in order to be built into these monuments. So I think the builders of Stonehenge simply used whatever they could lay their hands on in the immediate vicinity of Stonehenge, going further and further afield, and eventually they simply ran out of stones, and so at that point they just gave up on the whole project.
Right, okay. Well, that's the book Stonehenge Bluestones by Dr. Brian John. Brian, thanks so much for being my After Five guest today. It's been absolutely brilliant to talk to you again, and good luck with the publication.
Okay, thank you very much, Wynne. Nice to talk to you.
And you.
Okay,
Bye-bye.
bye now.